How can 91 degrees be a death threat in one city and a pleasant afternoon in another? It sounds like a trick question, but the answer is the single most important thing to understand about the heat now building over the Pacific Northwest. And it is the same answer that explains how a heat wave there once killed more than 1,400 people. This weekend, the National Weather Service is forecasting record heat for the region, using the same quiet language it used 5 years ago, right before the deadliest weather disaster in its modern history. I am going to show you exactly why that mild-sounding forecast should make your skin crawl. Stay until the end, because the last part is the part nobody wants to say out loud. Drop a comment telling me how hot it gets where you live, and whether your place even has air conditioning. Subscribe so you are never caught off guard when the forecast says record heat. Now, let us get into it. There is a particular kind of sentence in a weather forecast that should make the hair on your arms stand up. And this week, the National Weather Service office in Seattle quietly wrote it down. Record highs are likely both Sunday and Monday. 4 words and a verb, buried in the technical prose of a routine morning discussion, the kind of thing almost nobody outside of meteorology ever reads. But if you have been paying attention to the Pacific Northwest for the last 5 years, those words do not read as routine at all. They read as a memory. Because the last time this exact pattern set up over this exact corner of the continent, the forecasts said record heat too, and by the time it was over, more than 1,400 people were dead. Let me be clear about something right at the start, because this channel does not trade in panic, and I am not going to start now. The heat coming to the Pacific Northwest this weekend, peaking on Sunday, June 14th, and Monday, June 15th of 2026, is not forecast to be as extreme as what happened in 2021. Seattle is expected to reach around 91 degrees Fahrenheit. That is hot for the region, genuinely dangerous for reasons we are going to get into, but it is a long way from the apocalyptic numbers of 5 years ago. So, this is not me telling you that hundreds of people are about to die this weekend. They almost certainly are not. What I am telling you is something quieter, and, in its own way, more unsettling. The machine that produced the deadliest weather disaster in the modern history of this region is building again. The same ingredients, the same geography, the same fingerprints in the upper atmosphere. This weekend it is running at a fraction of its full power, but it is the same machine. And the region it is forming over has not fixed a single one of the things that made it so lethal the last time the machine ran at full strength. Here is what the data actually shows. An upper-level ridge of high pressure is building offshore on Friday night and then sliding east, settling itself directly over western Washington starting Saturday. At the same time, a thermally induced surface trough is developing along the coast, and this is the detail that matters more than any single temperature number. That trough flips the low-level winds. Instead of the cool, wet air that normally pours in off the Pacific Ocean and keeps the Northwest mild even in summer, the air starts moving the other way. It sinks. It comes downslope off the terrain toward Puget Sound, and as it sinks, it compresses, and as it compresses, it heats. The region's natural air conditioning, the ocean breeze that defines the entire climate of the coast, simply switches off. Up at around 5,000 feet, in the layer meteorologists call 850 millibar, temperatures are forecast to climb to near 20 degrees Celsius by Monday. That is the engine warming up. Down at the surface, the forecast highs run through the 80s and into the lower 90s on Sunday, then the 80s to the mid-90s on Monday. And the National Weather Service has flagged both days with a moderate heat risk, with a 30 to 50% chance of major heat risk in the southwest interior and the lower Chehalis Valley. Now, you might be looking at that 91-degree number for Seattle and thinking that does not sound like a disaster. In Phoenix, 91 degrees in June is a pleasant afternoon. In Dallas, it is barely worth mentioning. So why is the federal government attaching the words major heat risk to it? Why does a number that would be unremarkable across most of the country become a public health threat the moment it lands on the Pacific Northwest? That question is the whole story, and the answer is the reason more than 1,000 people died here once already. Hold on to it, because we are going to come back to it. And when we do, that innocent-looking 91 degrees is going to look a lot more menacing. The forecasters know exactly why they wrote those words. They wrote them because they remember 2021 too. There is one more number worth sitting with before we go any further. At Seattle-Tacoma Airport, across the entire historical record, only about 7% of days at this time of year reach 90 degrees or higher. 19 days out of 276. A 90-degree afternoon in the middle of June is not a hot summer day in the Northwest. It is a statistical outlier, the kind of thing that shows up a couple of weeks out of every decade, and it is arriving this weekend before the people living there have had any chance to get used to summer at all. To understand why that timing is so dangerous, and why the same calendar quirk turned 2021 into a mass casualty event, we have to go back to that summer. We have to go back to the week the Northwest cooked. In the last week of June 2021, the Pacific Northwest stopped behaving like the Pacific Northwest. For a few days, a region famous for drizzle and evergreen forests and sweaters in July turned into something out of the Mojave Desert, and the numbers it produced still do not look real on the page. The small village of Lytton in British Columbia sits in a river canyon in the mountains of Western Canada, a place where summer afternoons in the 80s are considered warm. On June 29th of 2021, Lytton reached 121.3 degrees Fahrenheit, 49.6 degrees Celsius. It was, and still is, the hottest temperature ever recorded anywhere in Canada, a country most of us associate with snow. The temperature was not even the worst part of what happened to Lytton. The very next day, June 30th, the village caught fire, and most of it burned to the ground in a matter of minutes. A community that had just set a national heat record for an entire country was, within 24 hours, a field of ash. If you wanted a single image for what an extreme heat event can do, you could hardly invent one more complete than a town that recorded the hottest temperature in its nation's history and then ceased to exist the following afternoon. South of the border, the records fell just as hard. Portland, Oregon, a city where many homes were built without air conditioning because they had never needed it, hit 116 degrees Fahrenheit. Seattle reached 108. These were not records broken by a degree or two. They were records shattered by margins that left longtime meteorologists genuinely shaken, numbers that the old statistics said should have been essentially impossible. Across Washington state, 128 separate all-time high temperature records fell. Across Western Canada, by June 29th alone, 103 all-time records had already gone down. But the temperatures, as staggering as they are not what this part of the story is really about. The reason we are here, the reason this event still matters 5 years later, is the human toll. When the heat finally broke and the counting began, the scale of it was almost impossible to absorb. Across the United States and Canada, more than 1,400 people died. Let that number land for a second. 1,400. From heat. In a region where most people had spent their whole lives believing that heat was something that happened to other places. In British Columbia, the official count of heat-related deaths reached around 619, and one careful study that looked at excess mortality, meaning how many more people died than would normally be expected, put the figure closer to 740 over a single 8-day window. That represented a 95% increase in deaths across the province in just over a week. In Washington state, the official heat death count was 126, but the excess mortality analysis told a darker story. Around 441 more people dying between June 27th and July 3rd than the statistics predicted, even after removing deaths from the pandemic. In Oregon, at least 79 people died, most of them in Multnomah County, which is to say in and around Portland. You have to understand who these people were, because the pattern in the deaths tells you everything about why this particular disaster was so cruel. They were overwhelmingly older adults. They were people living alone. They were people in apartments and houses with no air conditioning, in a region where, for generations, air conditioning had been an unnecessary luxury. Many of them did not have a way to cool down, did not realize how much danger they were in, and in some cases were found days later by neighbors or family. These were not people caught outside in the wilderness. They died in their own homes, in their own beds, in cities like Portland and Vancouver, while the temperature outside climbed to numbers those cities had never seen. The damage in 2021 went far beyond the human death toll, as staggering as that was. The heat was so intense that it physically broke the infrastructure of the region. Roads buckled and cracked as the asphalt expanded past what it was built to handle. The power cables that run Portland's light rail system sagged and failed in the heat, shutting the trains down across the city. Out in the fields, farm workers collapsed, and entire fruit crops were cooked on the branch before anyone could pick them. Cherries and berries baked into ruin while still on the plant. Along the coastline, the news turned almost surreal. Marine biologists estimated that more than 1 billion shellfish, the mussels and clams and barnacles that live in the shallows, were essentially steamed to death at low tide, the rock and water too hot for them to survive. Hospitals that almost never treated heat stroke were suddenly overwhelmed by it. Emergency rooms filling with patients whose internal temperatures had climbed to levels the human body is simply not built to tolerate. This was not a heat wave in the way most of the country pictures one, an uncomfortable stretch of days and a spike in the electric bill. This was an entire environment turning hostile to life itself, all at once, across hundreds of miles. And every piece of that is worth carrying with you as we watch the same machinery begin to turn again. The mechanism that did this has a name, and you have probably heard it thrown around on the news without much explanation. It was a heat dome, and I want to actually explain what that means, because the phrase has become so common that it has almost lost its meaning, and because the same mechanism is the thing assembling over the Northwest as you watch this. A heat dome is what happens when a ridge of high pressure in the upper atmosphere grows abnormally strong and then, crucially, stops moving. Weather is supposed to move. Systems roll through, one after another, west to east, and that constant motion is what keeps any single pattern from lasting too long. But in late June of 2021, the jet stream contorted itself into a shape meteorologists call an omega block, a great looping ridge shaped like the Greek letter omega, and that block locked the high pressure in place over the Northwest like a stuck door. Underneath that stationary ridge, the air did what air does under high pressure. It sank, and sinking air compresses and warms, day after day, with the sun beating down through cloudless skies and nothing able to push the pattern along. The high pressure aloft set records of its own. The heat just built and had nowhere to go. Add in the same offshore downslope flow we talked about a moment ago, that final compressing kick as the air came down off the terrain, and you had the recipe for the impossible numbers. Now here is the part I need you to hold in your mind as we go forward. Every single one of those ingredients, the strong ridge, the blocking pattern, the sinking air, the offshore flow, is on the forecast for this weekend. Weaker, smaller, less extreme, but present. The same machine, idling instead of roaring. And to understand why that should make anyone nervous, even at this lower intensity, you have to understand the strange and specific way the geography of the Pacific Northwest takes an ordinary high-pressure system and turns it into something that can kill. The Pacific Northwest is, under normal circumstances, one of the most naturally temperate places on Earth, and it has the ocean to thank for that. The Pacific is enormous, and it is cold, and it sits right against the western edge of the entire region. For most of the year, the prevailing winds blow off that cold water and onto the land, and that marine air acts like a thermostat that nobody has to set. It keeps the summers mild and the winters gentle. It is the reason Seattle and Portland and Vancouver can go entire summers barely touching 90 degrees, while the middle of the continent bakes. The whole climate of the coast is built on that onshore flow, that steady exhale of cool air off the sea. So what happens when you switch it off? That is the question, and the answer is the entire reason these heat events are so dangerous here. Specifically, the thing that protects the Northwest is also the thing that, when it reverses, leaves the region completely exposed. When a strong ridge builds and that thermally induced trough develops along the coast, the wind flips from onshore to offshore. The cool marine air stops coming in, and without that constant resupply of ocean air, the temperature is free to climb in a way it simply cannot when the sea breeze is doing its job. It gets worse because the offshore wind does not just remove the cooling, it actively adds heat. Picture the air flowing from the interior toward the coast, coming down off the higher terrain toward sea level. As any parcel of air descends, the pressure around it increases, and increasing pressure squeezes that air, and squeezing air heats it up. This is not a theory or a model. It is the same basic physics that makes a bicycle pump warm when you compress the air inside it. The atmosphere is doing exactly that on a massive scale, taking air and compressing it as it sinks toward the coast, and every 1,000 feet of descent adds several degrees. So the Northwest does not just lose its air conditioner during these events. The same wind that turns off the cooling turns into a furnace blowing the wrong way. Stack those effects on top of each other, and you can see how a region that struggles to reach 90 degrees can suddenly leap into triple digits. You take away the marine air. You add downslope compression heating. You park a record-strength high-pressure ridge overhead so that the sun pours down through clear skies for days with nothing to interrupt it. And you do all of it over terrain and cities that were built, physically built, on the assumption that none of this would ever happen. The homes were designed to hold warmth in for the cold, wet majority of the year. They have small windows, good insulation, and no mechanism to shed heat. When the heat comes, those same houses that keep you cozy in February turn into ovens that hold the temperature long after the sun goes down. There is another piece to this that made 2021 so severe, and that quietly raises the stakes every time the pattern returns, and it has to do with the ground itself. When a region has been running dry, when the soil has already surrendered its moisture, the sun's energy has nothing left to evaporate. Normally, a good share of incoming heat goes into turning soil moisture into water vapor, and that process consumes energy and keeps the surface cooler in exactly the same way that sweat cools your skin. But when the ground is parched, that release valve is gone, and every bit of the sun's energy goes straight into raising the temperature instead. A dry surface under a heat dome heats faster and climbs higher than a moist one, and it feeds on itself because the heat dries the ground further, which lets it get hotter still. The other defense the Northwest normally enjoys is the marine layer, that blanket of low cloud and fog that rolls in off the ocean overnight and slowly burns away in the morning, shaving the edge off the afternoon. During an offshore flow event, that marine layer gets shoved away from the coast entirely. The fog never forms, the clouds never arrive, and the sun gets an unobstructed shot at the surface from dawn to dusk. Take away the soil moisture, take away the marine layer, and the same sun the region barely notices for most of the year becomes something it has no way to fend off. That last detail, the part about the heat lingering after dark, is one of the quiet killers in these events, and it is worth slowing down on. Your body can tolerate a brutally hot afternoon if it gets a chance to recover overnight. The cool of the evening lets your core temperature come back down, lets you sleep, lets your heart stop working overtime. But during a true heat dome, the nights do not cool off. The air is too warm, the houses are holding the day's heat, and the temperature at 3 in the morning stays high enough that the body never gets its break. Day after day of that, with no recovery, is what pushes vulnerable people past the edge. And notice what the forecast for this weekend says about the overnight lows. It says they will be mild, in the mid-50s to lower 60s. Not deadly on their own at this intensity, but the same mechanism, the same failure of the night to cool, just turned down low. This is the thing about the offshore flow setup that I find genuinely eerie. It is not a freak occurrence, some 1,000-year fluke that we can safely file away and forget. It is a specific, recognizable, recurring configuration of the atmosphere, and the Pacific Northwest sits in exactly the wrong spot for it. When the ridge builds and the wind flips, the region's greatest natural defense becomes the instrument of its punishment. In 2021, that configuration reached an intensity nobody had ever measured. This weekend, in 2026, it is reaching an intensity that merely breaks records for the date. The difference between those two outcomes is not the mechanism. The mechanism is the same. The difference is only how far the dial gets turned. So if the mechanism is the same and the geography is the same, the obvious question becomes how hot it actually gets, and whether a 91-degree forecast is really worth your attention at all. And to answer that, we have to talk about the strangest fact in this entire story. The reason a temperature that would be nothing in Arizona can be a genuine emergency in Seattle. We have to talk about what heat actually does to a body that has never learned to expect it. Here is one of the most counterintuitive truths in all of weather science. Danger from heat is not absolute. It is relative. A temperature is not dangerous or safe on its own. It is dangerous or safe in relation to what the people experiencing it are built for, used to, and prepared for. And once you understand that, the entire picture of why the Pacific Northwest keeps appearing on lists of deadly heat events starts to make a terrible kind of sense. Think about Phoenix, Arizona for a moment. When the temperature there hits 110 degrees in summer, life mostly goes on. People are uncomfortable. The warnings go out. The vulnerable take precautions, but the city does not collapse. The reason is that Phoenix is built, top to bottom, for heat. Nearly every home, every car, every store, every office has air conditioning, and it works, and people use it. The population has lived with extreme heat their entire lives, so their bodies have physiologically adjusted in ways we will get to. The whole society is engineered around the assumption that it will be brutally hot, and so a brutally hot day is survivable. Now move that same temperature to Seattle or Portland, and you would have a catastrophe of historic proportions, because almost none of those protections exist. The Pacific Northwest has, by a wide margin, the lowest rate of home air conditioning of any major metropolitan region in the United States. For most of its history, it simply did not need it. Why would you install and run an expensive cooling system for the handful of warm days a typical summer delivered? So home after home, apartment after apartment, has no way to cool down at all. When the heat comes, there is nowhere inside to escape it, and the buildings themselves, designed to trap warmth against the long, cool season, hold the heat like a closed car in a parking lot. Then, there is the matter of the body itself. And this is where the science gets genuinely fascinating. Human beings acclimatize to heat. It is a real, measurable, physiological process. When you are repeatedly exposed to hot conditions over a span of 1 to 2 weeks, your body adapts in remarkable ways. You begin to sweat sooner, and you sweat more, and your sweat actually becomes more dilute, so you lose fewer vital salts. Your blood volume increases. Your heart becomes more efficient at moving blood to the skin to shed heat. Somebody who has lived through several weeks of building summer heat is, in a real biological sense, a different and more heat-resistant organism than they were at the start. This is why the same temperature that is routine in August can be deadly in June. The body in August has had its training. The body in June has not. It is worth understanding, plainly and without melodrama, what heat actually does to a body that cannot cope with it, because that is the reality underneath all of these statistics. Your body holds its core temperature inside a very narrow band, right around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, and it will fight hard to stay there. When the air around you turns hot, your main tool is sweat, evaporating off the skin to carry heat away, while your heart pumps blood out to the surface to be cooled. But that system has limits. If the heat is relentless, and especially if the air is humid, the sweat cannot evaporate fast enough, and the cooling begins to fail. As the core temperature creeps upward, past 103, past 104 degrees, the body's systems start to falter. The heart, already straining to push blood to the skin, can be driven past what it can sustain, which is one reason so many heat deaths are formally recorded as cardiac events. At the far end, the brain itself begins to overheat, and that is heat stroke, a true emergency in which confusion and collapse set in, and the organs begin to shut down. For a young, healthy, well-hydrated person with a way to cool off, all of this is a distant risk. For an 80-year-old with a weakened heart, alone in a sealed apartment with no air conditioning and no relief through the night, the distance to that edge is frighteningly short. That is the population these events find, every single time, and it is why the death toll always concentrates in the same tragic places. And this is the trap the Pacific Northwest falls into again and again, the reason the timing of these events is so vicious. The deadly heat tends to arrive early, in late June, exactly as it did in 2021, and exactly as this weekend's event is arriving in mid-June. It strikes a population at the precise moment they are least prepared, before a single week of gradual summer warmth has had a chance to build up their tolerance. The body is still set for spring. The homes are still set for spring. The whole region is, in effect, ambushed, hit with the hardest heat of the year before it has had any chance to get ready for the easiest. So now, go back to that 91-degree forecast for Seattle this weekend, the one that looked so harmless a few minutes ago. Put it in context. It is landing on a region with almost no air conditioning, in homes designed to hold heat, on bodies that have not acclimated before the summer has even properly begun, with nights too warm to allow a full recovery. Suddenly 91 degrees does not look like a pleasant afternoon. It looks like exactly the kind of number that sends the most vulnerable people, the elderly, the isolated, the sick, into real danger. That is why the National Weather Service, staffed by people who lived through 2021 and counted the dead afterward, looked at a 91-degree forecast and attached the words "major heat risk" to it. They are not being dramatic. They are being precise. I want to be fair and honest here, because that is the whole point of this channel. The heat this weekend is not 2021. The numbers are lower, the duration is shorter, with cooler onshore air forecasts to return by Tuesday, and the worst-case scenarios are not on the table. A great many people across the Northwest will experience this as nothing more than an unusually warm few days. Crack a window, complain a little, and move on. That is the likely outcome, and I am not going to pretend otherwise to scare you. But for the thinnest, most vulnerable slice of the population, the same slice that bore almost the entire death toll 5 years ago, even a moderate event in an unprepared region carries real risk. And the deeper question, the one that should actually keep you up at night, is not about this specific weekend at all. It is about whether weekends like this are becoming more common and more dangerous, and arriving earlier, year after year. So let us ask that question directly, and let us be honest about what the science can and cannot tell us. Whenever an event like 2021 happens, there is an immediate and very human urge to ask whether it was a freak accident or a sign of things to come. And this is exactly the kind of question where it would be easy to either overstate the certainty or dismiss the whole thing, and I want to do neither. I want to walk you through what scientists actually found when they put the 2021 heat dome under the microscope, because the answer is one of the clearest results in the entire field of climate science, and also one of the most carefully hedged. After the 2021 event, an international team of researchers ran what is called a rapid attribution analysis. The idea is straightforward, even if the math is not. You take the real world, the one with the warming we have already caused, and you compare it against a simulated world without that warming, and you ask how the odds of a given event change between the two. When they did this for the Pacific Northwest heat dome, the conclusion was stark. An event of that magnitude would have been, in their words, virtually impossible without human-caused climate change. The warming we have already put into the system made a heat wave like that one at least 150 times more likely. And without that warming, the same atmospheric setup would have produced temperatures roughly 2 degrees Celsius cooler, which is something like 2 to 4 degrees Fahrenheit. There is one more thing about 2021 that genuinely unsettled the scientists who study this, and it is not the raw temperature, but the statistics behind it. The event landed so far outside the range of anything in the historical record that, by the old way of calculating these odds, it should have been almost impossible. Not a 1 in 100 year event, but something closer to 1 in 1,000, or rarer still. When an event falls that far outside the curve, it forces an uncomfortable choice between two explanations. Either the region got astonishingly, once in a civilization unlucky, or the curve itself is wrong, and heat extremes are escalating faster than the models ever assumed. Several of the researchers who looked closely concluded it was likely the second one, that the tail of the distribution, the rare and catastrophic end of the range, is stretching outward faster than anyone expected. And if that is true, then the events we currently file under nearly impossible are quietly becoming merely unlikely, and the merely unlikely becomes the occasional, and the occasional, given enough years, becomes the ordinary. That is the real reason a moderate heat event in 2026 deserves this much of your attention. It is not this weekend's numbers, which are mild. It is what this weekend's pattern is a small, early sample of. Now, you might hear 2 degrees and think that does not sound like much. But in an event that was already killing people by the hundreds, where bodies were failing right at the edge of what they could endure, 2 degrees is not a rounding error. 2 degrees is the difference between a dangerous day and a deadly one. 2 degrees is the margin that decides whether a frail elderly person in an apartment with no air conditioning makes it through the night. The modeling went further, finding that the warmed climate version of the event was about 59% longer, 34% larger in area, and 6% higher in its peak intensity than the same event would have been in a world we had not heated. Every dimension of the disaster was amplified, so that part is about as settled as climate science gets. The background warming made the heat hotter, longer, and broader, and that pushed an already extreme event into mass casualty territory. But here's where I have to be careful with you, because there is a second question underneath the first, and it is genuinely not settled. And anyone who tells you it is, in either direction, is selling you something. That second question is about the pattern itself, not whether a hotter baseline makes any given heat wave worse, which is obvious, but whether the actual atmospheric setup, the blocking ridges, and the stuck omega patterns that lock these heat domes in place are themselves becoming more frequent because of climate change. There are 2 camps, and they are both made up of serious scientists. The first camp emphasizes what we might call the thermodynamic effect, and it is simple and certain. A warmer atmosphere is a taller atmosphere. When you heat a gas, it expands. So as the planet warms, the height of those upper-level pressure features keeps creeping upward, and the records for things like 500 millibar height keep falling. Part of why 2021 looked so extreme in the upper atmosphere by this view is simply that a warmer world has a puffed-up atmosphere, and the record was partly an artifact of that expansion, rather than evidence of some new circulation behavior. This camp says the heat is getting worse, mainly because the baseline is rising, full stop, and that is enough to explain everything. The second camp argues something more dramatic and harder to prove. They point to a process called Arctic amplification, the well-documented fact that the Arctic is warming several times faster than the rest of the planet. The jet stream, that river of fast-moving air that separates cold northern air from warm southern air, is driven in part by the temperature contrast between the pole and the equator. As the Arctic warms and that contrast weakens, the argument goes, the jet stream slows down and starts to wander, taking bigger loops north and south, and those big loops are exactly the kind of high amplitude, slow-moving, blocking patterns that lock a heat dome in place for days. If this is right, then climate change is not just making heat waves hotter. It is making the stuck, blocking, omega-shaped patterns that cause them more common in the first place. The honest state of the science is that the first effect, the hotter baseline, is certain, and the second effect, the wavier and more blocking-prone jet stream, is plausible, actively researched, and not yet proven. I am not going to stand here and tell you that the jet stream connection is established fact, because it is not. But I am also not going to dismiss it, because a growing body of work takes it seriously, and the physical reasoning is sound. What I can tell you with confidence is this. The thing that turns these events deadly, the rising baseline, is locked in and getting worse. And the thing that might be making the triggering pattern more frequent is a live and credible concern. Neither of those facts depends on a strong El Niño, by the way, which is worth saying, because people always ask. The ocean is in a neutral state right now, with the relevant index sitting at just plus 0.48. This heat is not being driven by some temporary ocean cycle. It is the blocking pattern, overlaid on a warming world. Which brings us back to the only question that really matters for the future. If the baseline keeps rising, and the blocking patterns are at minimum no less common than before, and quite possibly more so, then how many more times is the Pacific Northwest going to load this particular gun? This weekend is a warning shot. But warning shots come from real weapons. And before we talk about what that means, I have to deal with something else. Because every time one of these events happens, a very loud chorus appears online insisting that none of what I have just told you is true, that the heat is not natural at all, that somebody is doing this to us on purpose. Those claims deserve a real answer, not a dismissal, so let us give them one. Whenever a heat dome forms, a familiar set of theories floods the internet. And I am not going to roll my eyes at the people asking these questions, because the questions usually come from a real and reasonable place. When the weather does something that feels unnatural, it is human to suspect a human hand behind it. So let us take the biggest claims seriously, one at a time, and see whether they survive contact with the actual numbers. Because that is the difference between asking a good question and believing a bad answer. The loudest claim is that the heat dome is manufactured, that some facility or program is deliberately cooking the region, and the name that comes up most often is a research installation in Alaska that studies the upper atmosphere. The theory says that this transmitter, or something like it, is heating the air on command. So let us do the one thing the theory never does, which is check the energy. A continental-scale heat dome like the one in 2021 was trapping and re-radiating solar energy at a rate on the order of tens of quadrillions of watts, sustained for days, spread across millions of square miles. That is an almost unimaginable amount of power, the output of the sun pouring into a locked box of atmosphere. Now compare that to the facility in question, which broadcasts at a maximum of around 3.6 million watts. A few million watts against tens of quadrillions. The gap between them is something like 9 or 10 orders of magnitude, which means the heat dome is not 10 times bigger, or 1,000 times bigger, but billions of times bigger than the most powerful atmospheric heater human beings have ever built. You cannot close a gap like that. There is no transmitter, no secret array, no fleet of aircraft, no chemical sprayed from the sky that adds billions of times more energy than our largest machine can produce. The sun does that work. A stationary ridge of high pressure and the simple physics of sinking, compressing air do that work. The mechanism is ordinary, even when the result is extraordinary, and no hidden facility is required to explain a single degree of it. The energy budget simply does not allow for it, and the energy budget does not care how anyone feels about it. The second common claim is about cloud seeding and the trails that aircraft leave across the sky. The idea that these are somehow drying out or heating the region. And here it is worth being precise, because cloud seeding is a real thing that really happens. Under very narrow conditions, you can encourage a cloud that is already primed to drop its rain a little sooner by giving the moisture something to condense around. That is the entire extent of the technology. It cannot create a continental high-pressure ridge. It cannot lock the jet stream into a blocking pattern. It cannot add the planetary-scale energy that a heat dome moves around. Confusing a small, local, marginal rainmaking technique with the formation of a heat dome the size of a subcontinent is like confusing someone lighting a match with the eruption of a volcano. The scale is not even in the same universe. The third claim is the most uncomfortable one, and it deserves the most respect because it is the most testable. Some people argue that the death tolls are inflated, or that the temperature records are manipulated, all to push a particular agenda. Now, I happen to think the best response to a claim like this is not to get offended, but to actually check whether it holds up. Because unlike the others, this one makes a specific factual assertion we can examine. And when you examine it, here is what you find. The 2021 death toll was not produced by a single agency that you would have to simply trust. It was corroborated by several completely independent systems. The coroner service in British Columbia counted deaths one way. The medical examiners in Oregon and Washington counted another way. And then, separately, statisticians calculated excess mortality, which is a method that asks only how many more people died than the historical pattern would predict, and which does not depend on anyone writing heat on a death certificate at all. Here's the detail that ought to settle it. When those independent methods disagreed, the excess mortality numbers came in higher than the official heat attributed counts, not lower. In Washington, the official heat death count was 126, but the excess mortality estimate was around 441. If some agency were inflating the toll to push an agenda, you would expect the official number to be the exaggerated one. Instead, the official number is the conservative one, and the independent statistical method reveals that the true toll was almost certainly even worse than the headline said. The records work the same way. The temperatures came from separate national weather agencies in 2 different countries, using independent networks of instruments. For the records to be fake, 2 governments and thousands of separate thermometers would all have to be lying in perfect coordination, which is a far wilder claim than the simple truth that it got very, very hot. So none of the engineered heat theories survive the numbers. But I do not want to leave this section there, because there is a real failure hiding underneath the false ones, and it is the thing people are actually sensing when they reach for a conspiracy. The genuine scandal of these heat events is not that someone is causing them on purpose. It is that we are so badly prepared for them, and that the systems meant to protect people are so thin. Think about it. We have an entire national infrastructure built to warn people about hurricanes, naming each storm, tracking it for days, ordering evacuations, blanketing the airwaves. But heat, which quietly kills more Americans in a typical year than hurricanes and tornadoes combined, has no equivalent. There is no single agency mandated to run a real-time, mass casualty heat warning system the way we do for storms. In 2021, a great many people who died simply did not understand that a hot day could be lethal, because nobody had ever framed it that way for them until they were already in danger. That is the real story, and it is not a conspiracy. It is a structural blind spot. It is the absence of a system, not the presence of a plot. Consider this. In a typical year, heat quietly kills more people in the United States than hurricanes, tornadoes, and floods combined. And yet it draws a tiny fraction of the attention, the funding, and the warning infrastructure that those louder disasters command. A killer that arrives with no wind, no noise, and no name on a map turns out to be remarkably easy for a whole society to look past, right up until the moment the bodies are being counted. And it is made worse by everything we have already discussed: the lack of air conditioning, the unprepared bodies, the homes that trap heat, the early season timing. The truth is less satisfying than a secret villain, because there is no one to blame and nothing to expose. There is only a hazard we have collectively decided not to take as seriously as it deserves. And while we are on the subject of how widespread this blind spot is, it is worth noticing that the Pacific Northwest is not even the only place baking under a locked pattern right now. As the Northwest heats up this weekend, the entire East Coast is sweating through a heat event of its own, with advisories stretching down the Interstate 95 corridor and heat index values near 105 degrees from the mid-Atlantic northward, and forecasters there using that same loaded phrase, potentially record heat. Two opposite corners of the country, cooking at the same time, while the middle stays comparatively calm. That is the signature of a jet stream stuck in a big, stationary, high-amplitude wave, the very configuration we have been talking about, written across the whole continent at once. This is not a local quirk. It is one symptom of a pattern that has the entire country in its grip. So let us put the whole picture back together, because the individual pieces only become alarming when you see how they fit. We have a region with a unique vulnerability, protected by an ocean breeze that, when it reverses, becomes a furnace. We have a population and a building stock with almost no defense against heat, ambushed early in the season before their bodies can adapt. We have a mechanism, the blocking ridge and the offshore downslope flow, that turns an ordinary high-pressure system into a killer. We have a death toll from the last full-strength event that exceeded 1,400 people. We have a baseline climate that is certain to keep making each event hotter, and a triggering pattern that may well be growing more frequent. And we have, this weekend, that same mechanism quietly assembling once more over the same ground. This is the part where I have to hold two things in my hands at the same time, and resist the temptation to drop either one. In one hand is the honest, reassuring truth that this weekend is not 2021. 91 degrees is not 108. The event is short, the relief is coming by Tuesday, and the overwhelming majority of people in the Northwest will get through it without harm. I am not predicting a disaster this weekend, and you should be deeply skeptical of anyone who is. In the other hand is the uncomfortable truth that the only real difference between a warning shot and a massacre in this region is how far the dial happens to get turned on any given weekend. The gun is the same gun. This time, it is loaded lightly. There is no law of nature that guarantees it always will be. That is the thing I keep circling back to. The reason this story is worth an hour of your time, even though Seattle, is only forecast to reach 91 degrees. The pattern is no longer rare. The vulnerabilities that turned 2021 into a mass casualty event have not been fixed. The air conditioning still is not there. The warning system still does not exist. The homes still trap heat. The bodies still get ambushed early. And the ocean still flips from shield to furnace whenever the ridge builds. We learned exactly what this region's weakness is, in the most brutal way imaginable. And in the 5 years since, we have changed almost nothing about it. We just got lucky with the weather, and luck is not a plan. I think the question people instinctively ask about an event like this is the wrong question. They ask, will this weekend be bad? But that is not the question that should worry you. This weekend will very likely be fine. The real question is the one that sits underneath it, the one nobody with any authority seems eager to answer out loud. How many more times can a region reload the deadliest weather pattern it has ever faced, while doing nothing to prepare for the version that finally goes off at full strength? Because each of these warning shots arrives wrapped in the same 2 words the forecasters used in 2021. The same 2 words on the discussion this week. The same 2 words that will be on the next one, and the one after that. Record heat. 2 ordinary words that, the last time the dial turned all the way, were the quiet opening line of a story that ended with more than 1,000 graves. The atmosphere is rebuilding the machine over the Pacific Northwest as you watch this. This time, it is only flexing. The forecast says relief is coming, and it is. But the next time those 4 words appear in a Seattle forecast, record highs likely both days, I want you to feel what the forecasters feel when they type them. Not panic, recognition. Because we have read this sentence before. We know how the worst version of it ends. And the only thing standing between a warning and a repeat is a roll of the atmospheric dice that nobody, anywhere, has found a way to load in our favor.